Hi, everyone. This is Kim Wehle, Simple Politics. Today, my guest is Ghaith Al-Omari, who is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and an expert on what's happening in Israel and with the Palestinians these days. He was also on the negotiating team from 1999 to 2001 regarding talks for permanent status. And so I want to welcome you, Ghaith. Thank you so much for coming on to Simple Politics today.
Thank you so much for having me, Kim.
So, as we discussed before the show, the goal of this show is to break things down into the most basic things possible. So, before we get into the conflict that's happening right now, could you explain a little bit of the history of this region? How is it that we have a people, that is the Palestinians, who essentially don't have a permanent state? And I know this traces back at least to 1948.
First of all, I'm glad that you talked about 1948 because often we hear this being described as, back in the days of Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac and whatever. No, this is a 20th century conflict. It's a conflict that has really emerged from having two nationalisms: Zionism, Jewish nationalism, the idea that Jewish people are entitled to a state, and the Palestinian nationalism, the idea that Palestinian people are entitled to a state, competing over the same piece of land. And the nature of this conflict is such, of course, that both sides have a very legitimate, valid claim. In 1948, the Zionist movement was better prepared, better equipped, better planned. And basically, there was a war in 1948 when the Brits, who were the colonizing power in that region, withdrew. There were clashes, and Israel was created in 1948. The Palestinians did not have their own state at that point. The Palestinian national movement was decimated after 1948. The majority of the Palestinian public, around 700,000, give or take, at that time became displaced. Other countries came in. Many of the Arab countries viewed the Palestinian issue as a proxy tool in their own internal fighting, particularly between the progressives in the 1960s and the conservatives. And in the midst of all of this, the Palestinians ended up having no state. And it was not until the 1960s that we started seeing them recovering from the kind of trauma of 1948, and the Palestinian national movement as we see it today was a product of that process.
So, what was the state of affairs prior to 1948? Was there peace? Did each group have their own land? How is it that after 1948 we have 700,000 people with no place to live who presumably had a place to live prior to 1948?
Look, I mean, it's like the whole region, that area, historic Palestine, was under Ottoman rule. It was primarily lived by Palestinians, or what would later became known as Palestinians. There were always Jews there, but the Jews were not a majority. There were a majority in certain cities, but not overall. We started seeing in the late 19th century with the emergence of Zionism, which again is a fairly new concept. I mean, remember, the idea of nationalism is itself a 19th century concept. And so Zionism and Palestinian nationalism are both products of this thing. We started at that point seeing Jewish immigration to the homeland, to the Jewish historic homeland. And so what we ended up with, Jews who were historically expelled from there, and the Jewish narrative has never really given up on returning to that land. We started seeing the fulfillment of that. That became faster when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and then we ended up with the Brits, the British mandate. The British promised that at that point, I think Foreign Secretary Lord Balfour promised the Jewish people a homeland in historic Palestine. In fulfillment of that, we started seeing Jews returning to the land. Of course, the challenge is there were Palestinians living there. Initially,
Yeah, so that this is interesting. I was wondering how much the Allies post World War II, obviously after the Holocaust, how much they had an influence in this what is now a serious problem over there.
I mean, look, I mean, first of all, I mean, to be clear, I mean, we often hear that Israel is a product of the Holocaust. I think that's inaccurate. This inaccurate. I mean, the Jewish yearning to go back to the Jewish historical homeland way precedes the Holocaust. But I think after the establishment of Israel, we started seeing, I mean, a number of factors. One of it was there were certainly sympathy with the state of Israel in the kind of aftermath of the tragedy of the Holocaust. But also there were geostrategic and geopolitical interests in play there. Right after World War II, we just jumped straight to the Cold War. Israel emerged very quickly as an ally of the United States. Some of the Arab countries were undecided, they were unstable, etc. So we started seeing tremendous support for Israel. As I mentioned, the Palestinians really did not get their act together. Again, a nation that is reeling from the decimation of its political institutions, structures, social fabric, took a while to come back. Other Arabs came in for their own interests. Some of these Arab countries were actually aligned with the Soviet axis at that point. So this quickly became, a proxy arena for so many different things, for the Cold War, for the Arab Cold War, for different, when we saw the competition between, for example, Britain and France in terms of influence there. So this became kind of, the microcosm of all of these, sadly, often to the detriment of the inhabitants of that piece of land.
So 1967, another important year in this story. What happened then?
1967 again was a number of issues. I mean, if you want to look at the background, 1967 was a time where the Arab states attempt to monopolize the Palestinian issue and the competition in particular between Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt at that point, who was the kind of leader of the revolutionary wave that went through the Arab world in the 50s and 60s. We're competing with the monarchies, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, etc. But it also saw the emergence of the Palestinian national movement. Palestinians, a generation that grew up after the 1948 episode, started asserting themselves. This created a higher level of tension within the region. Part of this tension was played out with a bigger buildup of hostilities between Israel and its Arab neighbors. In June of 1967, Israel decided to launch what it calls a preemptive attack, what the Arab states call an aggressive act. But basically, Israel attacked the two major Arab countries at that point, Egypt and Syria. Jordan joined the hostilities. There was a war with Israel. And the war was basically won in the first 6 hours. Israel won the war. The rest of the it's known as a 6-day war. The rest of the 6 days were finishing up what happened in the first 6 hours. And Israel ends up holding two important pieces of land that did not hold in 1948. The Gaza Strip, which until that time was under Egyptian management, and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, that at that time Jordan had annexed and was under Jordanian a claim for sovereignty, a claim that no one really recognized except for the UK and Pakistan for some reason. So Israel finds itself holding territory outside its borders. So while the international community recognized Israel as it should, as a sovereign state within its borders established in 1948, the land that Israel took after 1948 was seen internationally as land that was not part of Israel, a land that was occupied. And much of the conflict ever since was what to do with this land. Do you add it to Israel, to give it to the Palestinians? Do you give it to other Arabs? This is really the questions that have been defining the diplomacy around this issue since 1967.
So I wish almost that I had a visual of a map, and I encourage people who are watching to just pull it up on Wikipedia, a map of Israel, and you can see, as you indicate, there's a strip of land called the Gaza Strip, and then there's a piece of land, a much larger one called the West Bank, all within some boundary of Israel, and almost like Swiss cheese, it looks like here are pieces that are dominated by Jewish settlements, or pieces where there are Palestinian settlements, and then it's bordered by two countries, Jordan and Egypt. What are Jordan and Egypt's position on the West Bank and Gaza in this conflict today? Are they involved in trying to resolve this? Are they willing to maybe give up some territory for Palestinians, or I mean, my because I'll tell you, Gaith, my view on this is, well, these people have to go somewhere, so there has to be a place for everyone to live. What are those two states' positions and interests in this today?
I mean, look, first of all, these two states continue, I mean, they're very big proponents of what we call the two-state solution. The idea that in the land occupied in 1967, West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, a Palestinian state will be established through negotiations with Israel. Jordan and Egypt have already both have had peace treaties with Israel. Egypt in 1979, Jordan in the mid 1990s. I can't remember the exact date. And they both, because they have relations, good relations with both the Israelis and the Palestinians, have actually been very constructive actors in the diplomacy that we saw in the 1990s. The 1990s, a peace process was launched initially by President George H.W. Bush, really came into full bloom under President Clinton, and Jordan and Egypt played a very important role. Now, Jordan and Egypt, while they do want to, they are, pushing for the establishment of a Palestinian state. Understandably, they don't want it to be on their expense. I mean, we've heard in the past ideas that, let's have a Palestinian state in Sinai, for example, a big desert area of Egypt. The problem with these kinds of proposals is, first of all, the Palestinians don't want it. Palestinians want a state in Palestine. We sometimes hear about the Jews, for example, that, before the Balfour declarations, some people were saying, let's have a Jewish state in Uganda, in Argentina. That's nice, but that's not where the Jews wanted to go. They wanted to go to a land that has symbolic resonance with them.
And so Jerusalem is important for both groups,
right?
Correct?
But I mean, but not only Jerusalem. If you ask a Palestinian, they don't tell you we want a state anywhere. They will tell you we want a state on the historical land of Palestine, West Bank and Gaza, because this is part of the national narrative. The narrative is about history, but it's also about geography. And I think at the end of the day, if you want to resolve this conflict, you resolve it within historic Palestine by sharing, dividing, and then sharing this land. You look at the neighbors as certainly Jordan and Egypt as supporters of this process. Sometimes giving incentive to the Palestinians and Israelis, sometimes putting pressure on the Palestinians and Israelis, but ultimately Jordan and Egypt, and fortunately, by the way, last year under President Trump, new Arab new countries have signed peace with Israel, and their role will become supporters in trying to reach a conclusion to this conflict, but a conclusion that is satisfactory to both the kind of Jewish national aspirations, which is the safety and prosperity of Israel, and the Palestinian national aspirations of creating a Palestinian state within the bounds of historical Palestinian land.
And what are those four countries that sort of were added to
Yeah,
the agreement?
I mean, the if you wish, the taboo was broken by the United Arab Emirates, one of the most interesting, diplomatically agile countries in the Arab world today, soon followed by Bahrain, a small kingdom in the Gulf. Both of them saw a convergence of of interest with Israel. Both are dealing with similar challenges: Iranian aggression, terrorism, etc. Both saw economic opportunity in this deal. And then two other countries came in, Sudan and Morocco, each for its very specific, almost, prosaic interests. But today we have 6 Arab countries that have official peace ties with Israel, and this can be an asset in any future diplomacy.
So where's the breakdown though then? I mean, have the Palestinians had an offer that they refused, or has there just been a constant no from Israel? Where are the fault lines here?
Look, the fault lines in general is that, look, I mean, when you talk about peace between Palestinians and Israelis, we're not talking about an abstract concept. We've actually, the Palestinians and the Israelis, have actually defined what it means to get peace. And to get peace, you have to resolve 5 core issues. The issue of Jerusalem, as you rightly indicated, the holiest location in Judaism and the third holiest location in Islam, very resonant for both sides. You have to deal with the issue of borders. What would be the borders between the two future states? The issue of security, what security arrangements you have, the issue of what do you do with the refugees, the descendants of the 700,000 people who were displaced in the 48 war, and then the issue of settlements, which is the Israeli civilians who moved into the West Bank in particular now, after 1967. So we know what the issues to deal with here. Frankly, so far we've had one of two instances. Either that the positions of the Palestinians and Israelis have not yet have not been in total congruence with one another, particularly on the two issues of Jerusalem and refugees, because these are the two major politically and historically resonant issues. A peace deal will require Israel, in my view, to accept a division of Jerusalem. That's a very, very difficult, heavy ask to ask from any Israeli leader. On the Palestinian side, the Palestinians have to give up the notion of the right of return. The idea that Palestinians will, and the descendants of these refugees, today we're talking about 8 million people, will come back to their ancestral homes in what's today Israel. That will be the end of Israel. This is a very heavy lift for any Palestinian leader. So a combination of the complexity of the issues, but also the fact that throughout Palestinian and Israeli, since the 1990s, we've never seen a moment where both political systems have been strong enough to make these kinds of compromises. So really, so far, we're talking about lack of agreement on issues, but also lack of synchronization of the political clock of the two political systems. And you look at it today. Israelis have just come out of their fourth election in 2 years, maybe going towards the fifth. The Palestinians have just canceled the first election scheduled since 2006 because their political system is so unstable. Within that environment, it becomes very difficult to talk about the compromises that you need to make to reach a resolution. So we've been at this kind of political standstill now for maybe a decade or so.
So, correct me if I'm wrong. What sounds like what you're saying is that neither government is strong enough to galvanize the populace behind one of these compromises that each has to make. That is, the Jewish state, Israel has to give up Jerusalem. Palestinians have to agree that not everybody can come back to that area, but neither has a strong enough coalition as a government to get the people behind that kind of compromise.
To be honest, I actually don't know to start with if the leaders want to make these compromises.
Mm.
It's very hard to go into someone's to interpret intention. So we talk about what we can measure, which is the political strength and political stability. And here it's very clear that because, as you said, of the weakness of the governing coalitions or governing systems, it's simply no leader wants to make this kind of decision just to have their voters, their populace, their constituencies rise up against them. So both are basically stalling.
So if we could break down a little bit each of the political systems that we're talking about, I want to start with the Palestinians. Can you explain what is the PLO and what is Hamas?
All right. So the PLO is basically it is an umbrella organization, an organization that was initially created in the early 1960s to be the diplomatic address of the Palestinian people. In international law, in order to be able to conduct diplomacy, etc., you need to have an organizational structure. So the PLO is the organizational structure that was created as a representative of the Palestinian people. The PLO is dominated by a political party called Fatah. It's a secular national political party, secular in the sense that they very firmly believe in the separation of state and religion, maybe quite socially conservative, but secular. Fatah started in the late 1950s with a very maximalist objective. The objective was to destroy Israel, to build a Palestinian state throughout historic Palestine, where Israel is today, full return of Palestinian refugees, and full commitment to what they called armed resistance, what we would call today terrorism. With time, they changed. particularly in the 1980s, they changed. And in the early 1990s, the PLO signed, I don't want to call it a peace agreement, but an agreement with Israel called the Oslo Agreement, in which both the PLO recognized Israel recognized the PLO, and this is what started the negotiations. One outcome of this is that something called the Palestinian Authority was created. The Palestinian Authority is the governing body on the ground that actually implements the Oslo Agreement and runs the day-to-day affairs of the Palestinians. Hamas is a newcomer to the game. Hamas is an organization established in very late 1987, I think December. It is the successor organization of the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood. So it has its roots in a very Islamist ideology, clearly seeking towards the establishment of a theocracy in Palestine. Really, it started out in the 80s as a small faction, a bit of an irritant. But with the signing of the Oslo Agreement, which entailed Palestinian recognition of Israel, that was their moment. They galvanized all of the Palestinians who refused that motion. They gained strength in the 1990s, both because in the 1990s, the promise and initial excitement of the Oslo agreements started fading, with negotiations stalling and failing to make progress, but also as the Palestinian Authority proved to be corrupt, unable to govern, etc., Hamas emerged and became stronger. In 2006, there was a Palestinian election. Hamas ran the elections on a platform of good governance, clean governance, anti-corruption. They won the elections. This created political tensions. In 2007, there was civil war. Hamas took over control of Gaza. The Palestinian Authority maintained control of what it controls in the West Bank. And ever since, the two systems have been in separation. More than 10 attempts, 10 agreements to reconcile have all failed. The most recent was an attempt to have an election that was supposed to settle at least, the political system. That was cancelled. And right now we seem to be in a fundamental split in the Palestinian system with no resolution in sight.
So we have Hamas in the Gaza Strip. We have the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Who are the top leaders in each? I mean, we hear the names in the news. Who are the people that are really running each of those groups right now?
The Palestinian Authority is very clear. It's led by Mahmoud Abbas, President Mahmoud Abbas, known as Abu Mazen. That's his nom de guerre. And he is emerged as truly, a one-man show. Very totalitarian in the way that he runs both the government and his own political party. So when you talk about the West Bank, you really talk about this one individual. Of course, there are others around him. Hamas is more complicated because Hamas is an organization that is divided into really three main branches. You have traditionally the Hamas leadership was in the diaspora because they knew that if they were working on the ground, Israel will be after them, the PA will be after them. Traditionally, there used to be a center of gravity, and they are backed primarily by two two regional countries, Qatar and Arab Gulf states, and Turkey, especially under the current Turkish president, Erdogan, who himself is an Islamist. Then you have the Hamas leadership that is in, and the leader, by the way, of that branch is a guy by the name Ismail Haniyeh, but also a very important figure is called Khalid Mishal, who is really the powerhouse in that group. Then you have the group that really runs Gaza. And this is a group that is focused primarily on how do you run Gaza. Until 10 days ago, basically, they had a degree of understanding with Israel. Certainly, there is no deep understanding with Israel. Hamas wants to destroy Israel. They're very clear about it. They make it, but at least in functional ways. They were there, and they're led by a guy called Yahya Sinwar. And then you have the third and really interesting part, which is the military wing of Hamas. And that is a branch of Hamas traditionally used to be very responsive to the political leadership. Last few years have become more politically independent. And what we saw with this current round of hostilities, the war that we're seeing today, are actually these guys are becoming more assertive. And it'll be interesting to see after this war if they will emerge as a bigger political actor. And they are run by a guy called Mohammed Deif.
So is the military arm of Hamas more tolerant of the existence of Israel than maybe some of the other parts of it? I mean, you mentioned the Palestinian Authority is has the under the Oslo Agreement has sort of an agreement with Israel. Hamas doesn't wants to basically destroy Israel. Is there any faction of Hamas that is more neutral or moderate or willing to compromise?
No.
No.
I mean, because the differences between these different factions are about tactics. Do
Mm-hmm.
you want to destroy Israel tomorrow or in 5 years' time or in 10 years' time? So there are maybe some tactical flexibility. For example, we saw the ones in Gaza being more willing to reach accommodations with Israel. But ultimately, this is tactics. The objective of all branches and all of strands is the same: destruction of Israel, and their commitment to violence is one that they see as fundamental to their kind of political identity.
And where are the Palestinian people, as between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, setting aside the tactics? And I say that because, in the United States, we're super faction right now as well, with some, 65% of Republicans polling believing that the election wasn't legitimately in the hands of Joe Biden, et cetera. Where are the people on the ground around this?
Um, by and large, they're sick of both parties. Of course, both parties have their core supporters. It's hard really to measure how much. I would want to say maybe 20% of the population is the core supporters of Hamas, slightly higher core supporters of Fatah. The rest are actually sick and tired of both movements for a number of reasons. First of all, the split itself has left such a scar among many Palestinians, and they both hold both parties responsible. Also, the fact that both parties do not present a compelling vision of how do you achieve the Palestinian national aspirations of having a Palestinian state. After 2 decades of failed negotiations, people simply don't buy what the PA, the Palestinian Authority, is saying, that we're going to get you independence through cooperation, diplomacy, and violence. After 3, now 4 rounds of wars in Gaza, the people also do not believe that Hamas's commitment to violence and terrorism will get them a Palestinian state. Add to this the fact that both the Palestinian Authority and Hamas rule in Gaza, extremely corrupt, have failed to produce any prosperity, etc. So most people now, if you look at the polling, and this has been consistent in the polling, tell you none of the above. We're sick and tired of the two sides. Naturally, many people in Gaza tend to be more supportive of the Palestinian Authority. And the flip is true. People in the West Bank supportive of Hamas. The grass is always greener. But ultimately, you have a society where the majority have zero trust in their political structures, political leaderships, and the kind of political visions presented by both. This is a moment of, I think, one of the kind of deepest moment of political crisis that the Palestinian political system has had really since, I would say, the 1940s.
Wow. And what's the view of Israelis from the Palestinian standpoint, from the, again, regular families, regular
Right.
people?
I mean, first of all, I mean, this is very, I mean, to be very clear, most Palestinians who live there view Israel as the enemy. Israel is seen as the occupier. A lot of the kind of ills that Palestinians face, they trace directly to the Israeli occupation and the Israeli rule. So there is, no real love. However, there are two major views when it comes to how do you deal with the issue. Traditionally, the majority of the Palestinians, despite whatever they thought about the Israelis, were willing to accept the idea of a two-state solution. A Palestinian state next to Israel. We don't have to love you, but at least we can be good neighbors. Now, after the failure of so many sets of negotiations and such 2 decades of failed diplomacy, many Palestinians today just don't buy it, don't think it's achievable. You talk to many Palestinians, they will tell you, yeah, two-state solution is a wonderful idea, not going to happen. And therefore, you have a lot of kind of lack of loss of faith in that. There are those who would never accept Israel, and those were really the core constituency of Hamas, who still see that Israel needs to be destroyed. That as well is a vision that most Palestinians don't buy anymore because they see Israel, they see it as a reality, and as a very strong reality. So what we're starting to see is the emergence of a new mode of thinking, which is, we can't beat them. We can't be neighbors. So let us turn this into a fight rather than a fight for separation, a fight for one state. The idea that let Palestinians and Israelis live in one state in this historic piece of land. Of course, in my view, this is also not, this is a recipe for further fights, because once you have this one state, you have to ask yourself, is it going to be a Jewish state, a Palestinian state? Is the official language Hebrew? Is it Arabic? Etc., etc. So you will, ultimately, the two identities are still there, still very strong, and you cannot just get rid of them in one artificial construct. So the Palestinians today as equally divided in the terms of how they see the Israelis as they are in terms of how they see their own leaderships.
So I want to put a pin in the Israeli government for a moment and take us 10 days back. I mean, the news reports identify three triggers, at least as I've read them, to this current conflict. One is an event at an important mosque. One is the attempt to resettle a handful of Palestinian families. And then the third is an important parade or event. And could you weigh in on, is that accurate? If you could walk us through what happened 10 days ago, why is this now so bloody with, hundreds of Palestinians and dozens of Israelis already dead, including many children? It's quite heartbreaking.
I mean, it is extremely heartbreaking. And I think it is very important for everyone who's addressing this is to at least have the decency to accept that what's happening is a human tragedy for everyone involved. I think that's a key point to focus on. You go back 10 days, it was almost a perfect storm. What you described earlier is, was happening within Jerusalem itself. And it's really hard to convey the how emotionally fraught the issue of Jerusalem is for Muslims and for Jews. Many of us outside look at it and say, it's a real estate dispute, etc. No, for Palestinians, Israelis, Muslims, and Jews, nothing in Jerusalem is simple. So what we saw, on the one hand, a perfect storm in Jerusalem. As you described, initially it started with an attempt to evict a number of Palestinian families living in East Jerusalem. To be honest, I still can't wrap my head around the kind of legal aspects of it. Israel claims that they are squatters. They claim that they had deeds, etc. The bottom line is that this is Jerusalem. It's not about the specifics. It's about the optics, and the optics were certainly provocative. Then you had this annual parade. It happened to be what in Israel they call Jerusalem Day. They celebrate the unification of Jerusalem in 1967. A lot of the activities that happened there are benign. Some Palestinians might not like them, but nevertheless, they are benign. But there's one specific event. It's called the March of Flags, where the most extreme elements of Israeli society march through the most dense parts of Arab East Jerusalem and chant the most horrible slogans. Anyone who is familiar with Northern Ireland can remember how some of these kind of parades that they had there that used to be flashpoints. So you had that happening. And that itself triggered clashes. Some Palestinians started using the mosque compound to throw rocks on Israelis. Obviously, the Israeli forces came in, I would argue, with excessive force. The images that came out of there obviously were very provocative. So this is part of the kind of backdrop, if you wish. Another part of the backdrop was domestic Palestinian. Just a few days before that, I mentioned before that Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas called for elections. A few days before that, he canceled the elections using Jerusalem as an excuse. He said that Israelis are not allowing them to have Jerusalem. Everyone knows that was just an excuse. He canceled it because he saw that his own party is going to lose. This got many Palestinians as well highly angry, and it got Hamas quite angry. So within this, Hamas, very cynically, I would say, saw an opportunity to score a point. So they fired missiles on Jerusalem, hoping that this will present Hamas as, the defender of Palestinian interest, hoping that it will strengthen Hamas's standing among the Palestinians at the expense of their rival, the Palestinian Authority. Israel, of course, reacted, and when we're back to this sadly familiar, sadly tragic cycle of events.
So it sounds like there was provocation on both sides, arguably. That is the resettlement of these Palestinian families, which I understand there was some, court support behind what the Israelis were doing, but then we also and interfering with this parade. But on the other hand, you said, Hamas, and we hear the president of the United States, President Biden, saying, the Israelis have a right to self-defense. Um, is there, you said it's a perfect storm, but why now, for example, would the Israelis decide to sort of poke a bear in the eye in this way? And is there something going on with the Israeli government? If you could talk a bit about Benjamin Netanyahu, what does it mean for those who are watching us who don't understand what it means to fail to create a government, because our United States government isn't that way? And what's going on for him politically and in terms of, the legal process involving him?
Well, I mean, I mean, maybe before I get to Benjamin Netanyahu, I mean, Israel itself, as a polity, has been drifting further and further to the right in recent years. In some ways, this is understandable. The peace camp that represented the Israeli left that wanted to have an agreement with the Palestinians, the failure of diplomacy, and a major round of fighting between Palestinians and Israelis that lasted between 2000 and 2005, what we call the Second Intifada, had basically decimated the Israeli left. So Israel has been already moving to the right. Bibi Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, we all refer to him as Bibi, that's his nickname. Bibi, basically, who is a very, very talented, skilled politician. He read the scene and he became prime minister, I believe, in '09, maybe '08. I can't remember exact what year. And he has been prime minister ever since. Now, he is an extremely divisive figure. There are those who I would even say worship the ground he walks on. I mean, his supporter calls him Bibi, King of Israel, in reference to the kind of old biblical kings of Israel. And those who don't like him really don't like him. He is not, your typical politician. He brings very strong emotions from supporters and foes alike. In this country, we're very familiar with that. So Israel is not a presidential system. It's a parliamentary system, meaning it doesn't have just two major big parties. It has a number of small parties. I can't remember how many parties in the current Israeli parliament. They call it the Knesset. I think 7 or 8. Don't quote me on this. But basically, if you want to, and no party has a majority. No party has a majority. And if you want to become prime minister, you have to bring around other parties to create what we call a coalition. In the last 2 years, basically, Israel has had 4 elections. Some of them, no one was able to form a coalition. They had to go to another round. The last election, not this one, but the one, the penultimate one that we had, there was a coalition, but Netanyahu decided that it was not favorable for him. He wanted a new election. The elections happened, and lo and behold, until 2 weeks ago, maybe, it seemed that Bibi miscalculated and he was on his way out. Now, on his way out is an important thing because it's not only the end of his political career. In the background of all of this, he is being accused of 3 major cases of corruption. At least one of them seems to be quite a strong legal case. As prime minister, he has immunity. So part of getting out of power is also, having a Berlusconi type of moment where he might go to jail. So the stakes are not only politically high, they're also personally high. So this is really the kind of environment that we're in. Until, as I mentioned, a couple of weeks ago, it seemed like he's on his way out. With the clashes and with the tensions happening, I guess like almost every nation, when you're in a moment of crisis, this is not the moment for change. And he seems to be, and his political fortunes seem to have been revived in the right now.
And take us into the Israeli point of view. What does the person on the street, I'm going to know we're, summarizing, what's the view towards the Palestinians? What's the view towards Bibi Netanyahu? What's the view towards a two-state solution versus sort of everyone living together versus destroying the vestiges or the germination of a Palestinian state?
I mean, it's Israel is a very complex society, obviously. So, as you said, it would be oversimplifying. But by and large, what you see right now, most Israelis, I would say, do not trust Palestinians. And this is actually very interesting. I mean, if you look at polls on both sides, you ask Palestinians and Israelis, do you want peace? Both tell you, of course we do. Do you think the other side wants peace? They'll tell you, of course they don't. And therefore, this peace is not going to happen, not our fault, their fault. And this, you see this in Israel. For many Israelis, there are two moments, there are two incidents, if you wish, episodes that defined how they see Palestinians. One was what I mentioned before, the second intifada, where you actually had Palestinian terror within Israel itself. And some of it was, ghastly, was awful. And so for many Israelis, they look and say, look, these people are supposed to be our partners. Here they are killing us in our homes. Then you had something. In 2005, Israel decides to withdraw from Gaza. Again, a very complex process and a very complex thought process that got to them there. Israel withdrew from Gaza. Hamas, as we mentioned earlier, managed to get control of that territory. And for many Israelis right now, the narrative they hear is, we left Gaza, we got rockets. So Israelis right now do not trust Palestinians in the same way that Palestinians do not trust Israelis. And Israelis, while the majority, I believe, again, a dwindling majority, but a majority until now, believes in a two-state solution, but also believes it's unachievable. And this is the stalemate that we have between the two sides. When it comes to Netanyahu, some Israelis worship him. Some Israelis cannot stand him. He is probably the most divisive figure throughout Israeli political history. But by and large, he has managed to hold on power since 09, I think, or 8. And it tells you that he has enough support within Israel itself.
So, would you say, and maybe this is a legal term of art, but would you say Gaza and the West Bank are officially occupied by Israel? And then my second question is, does that occupation affect everyday lives of Palestinians and their ability to access, basic services, water, electricity, education, things that we as in America expect to get from our government in exchange for our basic payment of taxes and citizenship?
I mean, first of all, I mean, just to kind of confer, amplify a point that you raised. When we say occupation, this is not a value judgment. This is actually a legal term. And I believe the situation both in the West Bank and Gaza meets this legal definition. In the sense that while Israel pulled out of Gaza, Israel still continues to control the perimeter of Gaza, who can go in, who can go out, what can be exported, what can be imported, etc. Israel has valid reasons to be concerned, for sure, but it doesn't change the fact that it is an occupation because Israel continues to control the ability of that piece of territory to control itself and its external borders in particular. The West Bank is a clearer case of occupation, where Israel continues to be in full control, except in the urban areas, in the cities, in Jerusalem, in the West Bank. In terms of the visibility and the impact on people's life, it is certainly not what we saw in the 70s and the 80s, where Israel was directly in charge of delivering the services, etc., that you mentioned. Now these services are delivered by the Palestinian governments, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza. Yet many aspects of Palestinian life continues to be controlled by Israel. If you want to travel outside the West Bank, you have to get permission from the Israelis. If you want to visit, someone in the neighboring village, you need the permission from the Israelis. You have a new birth, a new death in the family, a new marriage, etc. You have to register it with the Israelis. So the Israel continues to, while it doesn't control the day-to-day aspect, continues to have enough intrusion into Palestinians' lives without the Palestinians having political representation within that system. You know, these are not Israeli citizens. These are people who are stateless, but whose lives are controlled by a political system that they have no say in.
So let's talk a little bit about the American interests here. I read that Joe Biden spoke with Bibi Netanyahu and said he wants to see a quote significant de escalation. Netanyahu's public position seems to be that he wants to achieve his objective. I'm not sure what that is. What's the tightrope that the Biden administration and prior US presidents have walked here? What's the American interest in it? And why should regular Americans, I say regular, just people that don't have your level of expertise or even are inside the Beltway and have these conversations, why should people care about what's happening over there? How does it affect an American on the street, his or her interests?
I mean, first of all, I think like many foreign policy issues, it's very hard to have a direct causal linkage between, you know, the national interest and how that impacts an individual, an American individual. Ultimately, I think for most Americans, this is not something that directly impacts their lives. Of course, this is something that holds much resonance to many Americans, both because we're talking about the Holy Land here, you know, holy to the three monotheistic religions. We're talking about certainly a case that resonates morally in different ways with different people. But when you talk about the real interest that we're talking about here, we're talking about diplomatic, national security, foreign policy interest. And these are, you know, there are sets of interests there. One relates to basically, you know, at one level, Israel is a US ally, and the US wants to be seen as supporting its allies. So, you know, that's one set of interests. The US simply has an interest in stability, in lack of conflict. That is something that the US has an interest in. Traditionally, the Palestinian Israeli issue, until recently, until a few years ago, was seen as probably the most central conflict in the Middle East. That's before the Arab Spring and, you know, the civil wars that we saw as a result. And there was a sense that creating this, that resolving this conflict is key to bringing stability to the wider region. That's certainly what American officials were hearing from Arab leaders throughout the Arab world. Even today, as the importance of this issue has receded in favor of other regional challenges like Iran and terrorism, it is still a key issue for some of our key allies. For example, Jordan, a key US security and intelligence ally in the region, is destabilized by these kinds of issues, but also because of the fact that this is an issue that every time we have a flare-up, as we are seeing today, it tends to distract and undermine other American national interests in the region. Today, the Biden administration wants to focus on what it perceives, I think rightly, as the main challenge, which is Iran's both nuclear ambitions, but also destabilizing behavior. The president did not want to deal with the Palestinian-Israeli issue. Yet here we see him having 4 conversations with Prime Minister Netanyahu, 1 conversation with President Abbas. We see Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, in his European tour, spending half of his time on the phone with regional leaders. It is not something the US can ignore. And unless we stabilize it and ultimately resolve it, it will continue undermining some of our other interests. Again, hard to translate it of how this impacts, you know, my daily life. But if you look at the wider US strategic national security, foreign policy interest, this will continue to be a factor, an important factor in our Middle East policy.
So, where, Gaith, do you see this particular conflict that's escalated over the past 10 days going? Where do you see it going, and what would be your best case scenario and your worst case scenario?
Sadly, tragically, I would say that it's going exactly where every previous round of escalation ended up. This is the 4th major round of escalation between Hamas and Israel in Gaza. It will end in a ceasefire. We're already seeing, President Biden today talked about the need for a ceasefire, that he expects to see de-escalation today. The Egyptians, who are a key actor here, are close to concluding a ceasefire. Ceasefires will be reached. Yes, there might be a breakdown, but I expect and I hope that by the weekend, we will have an end of the hostilities. Yet where we end up after that is exactly where we began. Hamas in control of Gaza, continuing to be an irritant. Israel has not shown any willingness to be less escalatory in Jerusalem and elsewhere. We will go back to where we started, sadly, with many, many people dead and displaced in the process. The challenge right now, once this is over, is how do you create a mechanism, an international diplomatic process that actually minimizes, hopefully prevents the recurrence of this. And this is the challenge today. How do you rebuild Gaza? How do you provide a response to the humanitarian catastrophe we're seeing now in Gaza? I mean, we all see we talk about the human casualties, but the infrastructure, water, sewage, etc., is in tatters. So how do you rebuild Gaza and deal with the humanitarian situation without strengthening Hamas, a terrorist organization that should not be strengthened financially or politically? How do we find a way of re-establishing communication between and cooperation between Palestinians and Israelis in the West Bank? Maybe we cannot reach peace today because the politics is too weak, but there are many areas of cooperation that we can work on. How do you do that? How do you strengthen reasonable countries, constructive, positive countries in the region, Jordan, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, etc., in the face of the disrupted countries, Syria, Iran, etc., by creating a diplomatic process that helps them? I mean, these are all the challenges that we face today, because sadly, again, the reality on the ground, once the dust settles, will not have changed, except maybe for the worst.
Well, how do you think Joe Biden will do in this moment? I mean, he has many, many years of being at high positions in the government, not only vice president, but of course a senator, and he has reportedly a lot of expertise in foreign relations. Is he the right person in this moment, or what do you see happening with him as compared to recent presidents?
I mean, look, first of all, we can only ultimately judge when we see the final results. Uh, but so far, I think there are, two interesting aspects to it. First of all, what we see is really the same playbook that we saw both President George W. Bush and President Obama do when there was flare-ups during their terms in 08, 09 under Bush, and in 2014, and then later on under Obama. And he has been conducting the process, I think, skillfully, frustrating maybe for many. It's been slow, it's been deliberate, but that's the nature of of this president, slow and deliberate. But it's very clear where it's going. I think he has played a very skillful way of mobilizing our allies in support of this, because he understands, I think, that American leadership does not necessarily mean American monopoly. And for example, the Egyptians are much more capable of conducting a ceasefire than the United States. That's a fact. They have more assets, more equities in the game. We've been good in terms of mobilizing the allies. But I think his initial instinct was also right. He understood that you cannot resolve this conflict today, but he also understood that you cannot ignore this conflict and you need to make some progress on the ground. I hope that once the dust settles, that he goes back to this instinct. I know it will be tempting after this tragedy to say, let's go for big diplomacy. It's going to fail. Failure is not good for the Palestinians or the Israelis, whose, jadedness will only be deepened by another failure. And it's not good for the United States to be seen as ineffective and incapable of producing results. So I think it's important, once this is over, not to go back to a policy of neglect, but to a policy of realistic expectations, where you challenge the Palestinians and Israelis to have achievable, small but achievable progress that could build the ground for a future diplomatic process.
Right, so no
Again,
magic wand, no big policy that's going to say we fixed it. I know that big Biden win. It's just not realistic.
Every president since George H.W. Bush had tried. Madrid conference, Camp David under Clinton, Annapolis under George W. Bush, the deal of the century under President Trump. It's going to fail. The
It's just
same
so
reasons.
complicated. It's a
It's
very, very complicated
it's
situation.
complicated. I mean, there are moments where, I don't think it's unsolvable.
Mm-hmm.
But the challenge right now is how do you move the two sides to a place where they are more ready for a resolution. And this will happen through encouraging collaborative processes, etc. I mean, one thing we did not talk about, for example, and it's not often reported. Palestinian Authority and Israeli security forces cooperate on a daily basis. And they've been doing this now for, I would say, maybe a decade and a half, since the end of the Second Intifada. The US was key in establishing this collaboration. The US still deploys a 3-star general to help coordinate this. And as a result of this cooperation, today, and this might sound counterintuitive to a lot of the audience, today the biggest advocates for Palestinian interests are not the peace camp. They are the IDF, the Israeli military. Not because they've suddenly become, warm and fuzzy and huggable teddy bears. No, because they understood that they have partners on the Palestinian side who are dependable, who see eye to eye with them. And the flip is true. You talk to Palestinian security folks, they are the biggest kind of. So can we take this? This is not going to solve the conflict ultimately, but can we take this dynamic and replicate it in other areas? Can we show Palestinians that Israelis can do good things in the right circumstances? And can we show Israelis that Palestinians can be trusted partners? I think this is the challenge. And I think this is the initial instinct that President Biden had. If he goes back to this, I think, he might not be able to claim that he solved the conflict, but he certainly will leave a much, much better condition and landscape than he was handed when he became president.
Well, I'm glad to hear you think it's solvable. Do you think it is in your lifetime, or I know it depends on a lot of factors, because leading up to the first half of the conversation, I said to myself, wow, this seems intractable.
If I did not believe it was solvable, I would have found myself another job.
Right. No, I certainly
I
appreciate
mean,
that. Yeah.
no. I mean, maybe you can argue it's the triumph of hope over reason.
Right.
But as a former negotiator, I know how close we got to
Hmm.
reach a deal. As someone who lived there, who have many Palestinian and Israeli friends, I know despite all of the kind of frustration, don't want to call it cynicism, frustration, deep frustration, there's still a desire for things to move forward. I was there when the Oslo agreements were reached in the midst of a very, very tense moment where Palestinian and Israelis were killing one another on the streets. When the deal was reached, public opinion flipped overnight. And I'm a believer in leadership. I mean, if you, I'm not that old, but people who remember when Anwar Sadat landed in Jerusalem in 1979, I believe, or 78, and change history. So, I mean, there are moments that change can happen. The question is, are we building globally on the ground, etc., people who are there, ready and willing to jump on the opportunity and make it happen? Or are we feeding the anger, cynicism that we see? And there are many people who are interested in this. And I think this is important for us in the United States. I mean, this is one of the most divisive issues. You're a professor, I'm sure you see it on your campus. I see it in our communities, etc. And it is very important for us to actually approach this not as a divisive issue, but as a problem, as an issue that problem that needs to be solved. How do we apply our problem-solving skills? How do we apply that? How do we have humanity where I can say, I'm not going to give up my Palestinian narrative, but I will respect that the Israelis genuinely have their own narrative and they believe it from a place of conviction, not malice. How can we do that on the other side? Because I think here we can create the political environment for our own leaders to be more constructive. So I am hopeful. Maybe I'm not, maybe I will not see it in my lifetime, but I think there's so much that we can do as individuals that will get us closer, will get the Palestinians and Israeli closer.
Well, it's interesting to hear explain that because you could almost apply that same sort of hopeful wish for humanity and tolerating each other's point of view and bring it to home to Americans right now in our polarized moment. I was really struck by a clip I saw of a girl, 10 years old. I have a daughter the same age, Palestinian girl standing in front of a building that had been destroyed in tears saying, "There's nothing I can do about this. I can't fix this. I just want to be a doctor. I just want to grow up." And honestly, Gaith, that really kind of grabbed me in terms of the shared humanity, and we all can relate as a parent or as someone we were all children at one point. It really struck me. This little girl is stuck in the middle of this conflict that she deserves to get out of. And so I want to ask you, as my final question, if there's one thing, that one myth or one issue that you would like to dispel, something that is some stereotype or misunderstanding around this that you would like to give some clarity to it on an end note, what might that be?
I would say do not essentialize either of the two sides. Meaning, we have a tendency, if you are pro-Palestinian, to say all Israelis are evil and all Israelis are complicit in everything that's bad that's happening. And if you are pro-Israeli, often you have a tendency to say all Palestinians are complicit. You look at the picture of that girl that you talked about. You can read two things into it. You can read what you read, which I think is the right thing to read. There is shared humanity. How do we move forward? How do we make sure that this girl and the girl in Sderot in Israel, etc., get to live this and to look forward, not be stuck in the past? Or we can look at it as many people do, to say, look, this girl is proof of, the barbarianism of Israel, or that Hamas uses civilians as human shields, etc. We have a choice in terms of how we react to what's happening there. It is heartbreaking. For anyone who has a shred of humanity, it's heartbreaking. Do you take this and use it as fodder for further divisiveness, which, by the way, you and I, living in our comfortable home in DC, we're not going to pay the price for. Mm-hmm. People back there are going to pay the price for. Or do we look at these images and say that, you know what, this is what we need to prevent presenting? So as I leave people that I talk to with this one question: do you want to see yourself as part of reaching the solution, or do you want to see yourself as part of deepening the conflict? I don't want to make moral judgments. Everyone makes their own choice, but I know where I would like to stand. I would know where I would like to see most people stand. We need to make sure that there's no more of this violence, and if that requires us to compromise, we have to compromise.
Well, Ghaith Al-Omari, I want to thank you again for being on the show, Simple Politics. I think that this explanation has brought at least me, and I'm sure many of our viewers, one step closer to understanding the complexities and hopefully being part of the solution and not exacerbating the problem. So thank you again for your time and extraordinary expertise.
Thank you so much, Kim. Thank you, and for everything that you do.
This is really, really interesting. I'll bet that's a cut, but thank you so much. This is absolutely amazing.
Thanks. I'm sorry if I went too lyrical or too long, but
it was no, you were extraordinary. It was just spot on.